Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. The last few weeks, we've been looking at some of the strains that have fed into American popular religious consciousness, the spiritual but not religious movement, etc. I want to end up this discussion this week, and then we will go on to some other topics for next week. Where we started, though, is the very odd, perhaps, and interesting fact that Thoreau and also Emerson, two Unitarian transcendentalists, really begin this movement, and especially Thoreau is co-opted by various people through time as a kind of icon to what's going on and, how are they being used, basically? What did they even mean to do what eventually is being done in their name, essentially? Right. So that's part of what's going on here. I should mention a book that I've just started reading. A member of FUS said, you've got to read this book. It's just come out. It's called High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s, that meaning 1970s, by Eric Davis, who is a U.S. cultural critic. He did a rather famous book a few years ago called Spiritual Supermarket about California specifically, in how California has been a matrix of spirituality and ideas. It's a fun book, what I've read so far, but really you see what's going on here, that all of the ideas I've been tracing have ended up, shall we say, in places that the originators probably didn't think they would. So how does drugs, esoterica, and visions in the 1970s come out of a transcendental viewpoint? Very interesting idea. And, so H.P. Lovecraft and speculative fiction, et cetera, suddenly comes into this whole idea that goes back about, again, one mountain and many paths. Is this even true? I do want to end up by discussing really a very simple idea that hadn't been discussed along those lines, and that is the idea that, wait, this isn't true. None of this really makes sense. This is a position that is more and more popular in religious studies programs in the United States. Stephen Prothero, professor of religion at Boston University, is one of the people who has been leading the charge. His most famous book on this is The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World. God is Not One. And in it, Prothero says, wait a minute, no, you can't say that all of these religions are going toward any particular point. You can't bulldoze the differences in religions and suddenly say that there's one truth out there. This is just playing with the facts, and nothing supports it to say, wait a minute. This can't be true. So Prothero basically is talking about the idea that religion is culturally based, and you can't get out of the cultural bases of religion to talk about it as some kind of an abstract concept. Yesterday, I was talking, for example, about William James, who says the religious experience is this, and it's a psychological thing, and it's like this. Well, Prothero and many other critics nowadays will argue that, no, that's a very white European idea, that everything can be boiled down to these very abstract scientific, psychological ideas. And no, you can't do that. It's much more complicated than that. A few quotes from Prothero here. He says, true, Jefferson's rational religion ran in rivulets outside the American mainstream, but heterodoxy is faith of a different form and, like orthodoxy, should be recognized for what it is, a way of being religious. And I would say that that's an argument that fits for both liberal religionists, Unitarian Universalists, etc., but also for the H.P. Lovecraft fans who are going to say that actually religion comes from another planet, and those kinds of arguments, they need to be recognized, says Prothero, within the idea that they have to be taken seriously as religion and examined and then guess what? They're probably not going to add up eventually, right? Here's a very interesting claim that he makes in the book. A few years ago, I was standing around the photocopier in Boston University Department of Religion when a visiting professor from Austria offered a passing observation about American undergraduates. They are very religious, he told me, but they know next to nothing about religion. Thanks to compulsory religious education, which in Austria begins in elementary schools, European students can name the 12 apostles and the 7 deadly sins, but they wouldn't be caught dead going to church or synagogue themselves. American students are just the opposite, says this professor. Here, faith without understanding is the standard. Here, religious ignorance is bliss. And it's a very interesting point. You can buy the argument or not, but the fact that we have this odd separation of church and state in the United States, in which public education avoids religion, but religion is fed into people without any academic background, is perhaps dangerous. It's a good argument, and Prothero makes it quite a bit. He has another book called Religious Literacy, in which he argues that, this is what Americans need to know about the religious history of the U.S. before we even begin to talk about voting and power relations and white nationalism and all of these things. So, interesting argument. He goes on to say in the book, both tolerance and respect are empty virtues until we actually understand whatever it is we are supposed to be tolerating or respecting. Interesting question. Again, Madame Blavatsky is going to go right past any problems that there might be culturally in religion to say, oh, it's actually talking about God as this or that or the other. No, says more contemporary religious professors, no, you can't do that. By the way, Prothero's latest book is Religion Matters, an introduction to the world's religions. Again, looking very specifically at the idea that religion is culturally based, and we need to pay attention to that before we start talking very broadly about what religion is. He goes on to say, almost all religions provide opportunities for human beings to convince themselves of their own righteousness, to speak in the name of God, and even to go to war on God's behalf. This blasphemy of certainty is also rife among secularists who, in their case, have not God, but science or the proletariat on their side. In other words, everyone is claiming to be the right one and therefore can dictate to all other people, either because of God or science or economics, etc. Very interesting point. And one of those things that we have to say, wait a minute, I guess there is some extremes on both sides of this. And are we dealing with things about religion, either from the left, the right, middle, etc.? And are we being honest about those kinds of issues? Okay. Pretending that the world's religions are the same does not make our world safer, says Stephen Prothero. Like all forms of ignorance, it makes our world more dangerous. What we need on this furiously religious planet is a realistic view of where religious rivals clash and where they can cooperate. Go back to thinking about the Parliament of World Religions in the 1890s and how some religious thinkers were saying, no, this needs to be kept separate. We need to think this through. Europeans need to stop attacking our cultures, and others saying, well, come on in, learn about us, etc. Again, very complicated in its actual implications. We know how it did work out, but how could it have worked out, and how maybe we want it to work out in the future. Last quote I'll use, spirituality, in short, is religion stripped down to its experiential dimension. More than do-it-yourself religion, spirituality is do-it-without religion, a form of faith that denies its connections to the institutions, stories, and doctrines that gave it birth. religion without memory. And this is a very specific attack on the entire idea of psychology and religion, with William James on down, that somehow we can get at some essence that is purely subjective. So spirituality, in short, is religion stripped down to its experiential dimension. More than do-it-yourself religion, spirituality is do without religion, a form of faith that denies its connections to the institutions, stories, and doctrines that gave it birth. Religion without memory. We know how Prothero thinks about that. My question is, how do you think about that? And is this actually a dangerous step in the history of religion in the United States, or is it a logical extension of the cranks and seers and sages that I've been talking about, that starting way back in the 19th century and tracing them down with this idea that all religions are one? Thanks for listening to this part of our talks, and we'll be back next week talking about some more tradition within liberal religion itself. Yes, there is a tradition, it just isn't this one. And that's the way to really begin to think this through. Join us for Sunday Assembly if you have been checking in and say, hey, maybe this is humanism is something that I'm interested in. Our Assistant Minister, Rev. Kelly Clement, will be talking this Sunday about We Begin Again in Love, talking about Yom Kippur and ideas about regeneration in a very divisive time. Thanks a lot for listening. You can help us out financially and keep us strong on the air by giving to PayPal or firstunitarian.org/donate. Also, you can find out lots more about what humanism and First Unitarian Society mean on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks a whole lot, and we will be having a bit of a discussion here in a few moments. Thank you. I will stop sharing here. All right, good. We can start with a good question.
The Prothero thing is intriguing and provocative, especially for Unitarians. I think he's challenging a pretty central tenet of our so-called faith, which is this universality of things and sameness. I'm willing to, like any good Unitarian, question my own assertions. But as I said in my question here, I don't get how it makes the world more dangerous to emphasize this sameness.
Yeah.
He seems to be, it's kind of a depressing or worrisome analysis that these differences are somehow irreconcilable. Maybe he's not saying that, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, and I and of course I can't speak for him, but where I think he's going is that, and this is a general direction of religious studies in the last decade or so, is that what the real impulse was from Thoreau and Emerson. Remember, they're saying, "Oh, Hinduism, these are great ideas. We're going to co-opt them. We're going to take them and make them ours." Which is very human, and it's called, it's a synthesis, and that's not a bad idea. It's very human, right? But what begins to happen as we go forward with Blavatsky and Ouspensky, et cetera, is that suddenly we have Europeans looking at all these different religions in colonized places, right? And saying, yes, people of color, we think you're so smart for thinking of that. We're going to take that, and we approve of that, but you can't believe this over here, right? And so it's a colonialist, right? It's a colonialist move in this way of thinking. It's a colonialist move that's taking people's religions just as we're stealing petroleum, right? It's colonizing, it's taking stuff, not really respecting the cultures that are involved. And just taking the ideas and saying, okay, they're there, we like you, fine, as long as you think like this, is in our understanding.
It seems like I'm a little worried about this wholesale adoption of cultural appropriation as the entire truth of things. I think it overlooks genuine appreciation sometimes, and I think people are going too far with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very valid point to say that. My favorite example is the Day of the Dead, which is a central Mexican holiday that developed in a particular place. It developed out of folk practices that really had nothing to do with colonialized Roman Catholicism. And it developed in the central states, and then it became popular in the rest of Mexico. And then it became popular among Mexican immigrants in other countries, especially the United States. And then it spreads into American culture. And now it's becoming popular in Europe. So who is appropriating whom is a good question, right? Christmas did that too. It was popular and people adopted it, but were they appropriating it? And again, I mean, that's a very complex question. Who is appropriating whom in this case? Is the holiday so strong that it overpowers lesser ideas about fall celebrations and that kind of thing? I think that's a very valid question. Yes, Paul.
I think it's a problem here with this academic study or anybody else. And I guess under kind of Platonism, well, religion is X, Y, Z. Well, no, the way I see it, there's just human behavior of a bazillion different kinds. It's useful to organize it into, well, here's institutions, or here's, spiritual practices and such. And sociologists can study institutions and history and all that context. Somebody else can look at the inside spiritual part. Neither one is right or wrong. They're just different techniques for understanding this universe of behaviors. And who's to say what is and is not religion?
Well, yes. And the Eric Davis book I mentioned, as I say, I've just started reading it. But, the problem is, or the challenge, it's not a problem, is where do we stop? So that, there have been, H.P. Lovecraft inadvertently created a religion that is now being practiced, right? Now, we know that cybernetics was a science fiction idea that was consciously turned into, by its creator, it turned into a religion, right? But apparently H.P. Lovecraft's material was used after he was dead, right? The same is true of Philip K. Dick. I mean, he's now become this icon of with the Matrix, et cetera. This guy died in the early 1980s. He's not thinking anymore, but his ideas have now become an underlaying of people's understanding of reality. And in this way, I mean, I suppose I'm not trying to make a value judgment. I'm just saying this is the way it is, and it's interesting that we're doing that. Yeah. Oh, you know what, Anthony? I want to call on you because I know that you have just gotten a scholarship, and you will be discussing some of these ideas, not the crazy Californians, I assume, the religions, I assume. But do you mind kind of describing what you're going to be writing about, thinking about?
Sure. Thank you, David, for that. So I submitted a proposal to the UUA, to one of the ministries, and under the banner of the exploration of religion and ethics. and to get a grant to do that research. And basically, what I am trying to explore in this soon to be research is actually the process of decolonizing ethics and challenging the subculture of assimilation that is dominant within humanist congregations in terms of thought and practice. And so I found it so amazing that you were talking about God not being one, since it is one of the courses that we took at the now defunct Humanist Institute, where how do we explore religion? How do we explore culture, and what does that mean? And then how does that tie to an extent, to process of decolonization, right, in terms of thought and practices. And so I think that it is really interesting. And Dane, thank you for kind of raising that question of to whom the culture belong to, right? And I think part of that question, at least for me, then is to explore, well, what cultural lens are we using? Are we talking about the culture that births from the elite, right? And then we would need to define who the elite in a particular society is. And then we would need to explore, is it the culture of the masses, right? Is it the culture of the people, or is it the culture of the elite, right? And so for me, culture would mean, for example, the organic process that births from daily living. And then that would connect to the culture of the people. Because similar to what Prophet was saying, one thing is what we kind of produce, define, construct, right? And then repeat within academic and intellectual circles. And then the other thing is, what do ordinary and regular people that are not involved in the privilege of of the ivory tower, basically, right? And that example we could use depending on where you live, right? So if you live in Minneapolis, and particularly in the really middle elite, right, professionalization is one thing, but what about St. Paul? What about Woodbury? What about Minnetonka, right? So like, how are we defining our worldview? And what lenses are we really using to then define concepts? I think it's really important, and particularly within humanism, right, where we then connect to ethics and say, well, humanists need to think this way because this is the way that we have done it. And part of the process of really beginning to decolonize humanism, though some people do not believe that humanism can be decolonized, it's really understanding the dynamics of power, right? And in the dialogue of cultural engagement, what group has, for the longest time, sustained the power, defined, redefined culture, behavior, beliefs? And in that process, are we giving people, well, not giving them, right, but becoming aware that we need to set boundaries and respect other people's processes?
Yeah.
And as I was hearing the beginning of this recording, I was thinking of Edward Said, and in his book Orientalism, and where he begins to state the dynamic that unfolds in the relationship between Great Britain coming into Egypt, right? And how these elite individuals were saying, well, we know Egypt, right? We are the intellectuals, and we're going to define for Egypt what's best for them because they do not know, because they're savages, and we're going to give them reason, and we're going to give them religion, and we're just going to really help them move forward in civilization's process of development, right? And so there was an appreciation for culture, but at the same time, there was a devaluing of culture and their self-worth as a civilization that already existed and was flourishing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And this is, this is cutting edge research, and it is difficult to get the mind wrapped around. One of my arguments is that humanism, in its basic core of liberation from, is a worldwide available, but it has to be there. I think there has to be an African American humanism, right? There has to be a Caribbean humanism, and so even within this country, there are many different humanisms. But when you go to Africa, what are those humanisms going to look like? And London can't tell us, what humanism is. In the class I'm teaching, I started out with a book by a Brit, saying this is what humanism is. It's British humanism, very unlike American, actually. And that's why I was doing it. So my students would say, oh, I don't think that's not what UU humanism is like. And then I had them read this book called Lived Religion, Faith and Practice in Everyday Life by Meredith McGuire. And it's a sociological look at how people actually live. And I mentioned that before, that people have Buddha and St. Christopher and, people really do have these different religious ideas floating around in their head. And we asked this question here a couple of weeks ago, when we brought up the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, that FUS people, First Unitarian Society people, said, no, we're not going to have you put that responsible in there. Because who gets to say what's responsible? and clearly the answer is these old white guys who go to seminary, right? That's part of the problem with who gets to decide. We're smarter than you, and we get to tell you what's responsible. Yeah, Ron. Yeah, I saw your hand.
I keep stumbling over simple stuff like honoring and witnessing. And so when I look back on the European arrival in this country and their attitude towards the Incas and the Aztecs and the burning of the codices for the Mayan, and it's a disdain for other people's culture. Mm-hmm. And how to find a way for people to respectfully interact and try to understand the structure of other cultures as we meet them is a way underappreciated necessity. I think Star Trek talks about it sometimes, but I think about how the stories that came to me out of Vietnam was that when the emperor came to a village, a small little village, the emperor brought a gift to the elder and would sit with him because they were equals. In truth, they'd lived the same amount of time. He was a respected person in his community. How come he was respected? And how can the emperor maybe acquire that or learn that? And so he comes as a student. As soon as he steps back outside the gate, if the elder follows him, then he would respect the emperor because now he is in the emperor's area.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And those kind of exchanges that are equal, but have different, economic symbols attached to them, are important things to try to acknowledge, honor, and understand, and witness without doing anything. You just witness. Yep. And I don't know what to make of all that. I just know that the important thing is the humbling and which acknowledges my smallness and reflects my curiosity. Mm-hmm. 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 And both of those things, I think, are wonderful to bring to any table.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes. I mean, you remember the Pope, and in 1493, says, this new world is terra nullis. It's empty earth.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It's empty earth because they don't have religion. They don't have an idea of private property. They don't have guns, and therefore they don't exist.
Gunpowder.
Right? So we get to take all their stuff, right? And this was a decision within Christian Europe. That then the Protestants began to decide, hey, wait, the Catholics are getting ahead of us on stealing stuff.
And from what I understand, David, the doctrine of discovery has been assessed as being an undergirding element of our whole legal system.
Oh, absolutely.
Whoa, just a minute. Can you reassess your whole legal system in a way that honors what's been done and recognizes its shortcoming?
Yeah. Well,
is there a process for that culturally?
Yeah. Well, the doctrine of discovery is a very, problematic document. I mean, I've talked before. I own a farm that my forebears homesteaded from the government, and so I have, so my deeds to my farm talks about the U.S. government owned that land. Yeah. Now, how did the U.S. government and gave it to my family for 64 cents or whatever it was an acre? Okay, how come the U.S. government owned that land? Well, because they had stolen it. So the U.S. government didn't own that land; it was already stolen, right? So my deeds to my farm are illegitimate, actually, morally so. Now you can simply say that the U.S. government is strong enough to make every deed it wants to be whatever it wants, right? We still have a military, and the military is, but no, it really it ain't that way, and we, it's stolen, and then we say, well, yeah, but the Indians, from where I'm from, the Shawnee Indians, well, they're gone. Well, no, they're not. They're in Michigan.
or who did they take it from?
Well, there is that as well. So and so we've also always said, the last of the Mohicans, we've also said, oh, the Indians are disappearing. Yeah. But Indians will say, well, wait a minute, we didn't disappear. You just kept running us off and ignoring us, right? Based on this Catholic document from 1493, So, I mean, it's very complicated when you begin to actually think it through. I know that the Minnesota Council of Churches, which is a Protestant organization, is debating this right now. Should they start talking about reparations? And let's talk about reparations to African Americans. Yeah, but what about the natives? All right, and that, which is a totally different can of worms for the state of Minnesota, right? And so, are they brave enough to actually say what actually happened? And
and being brave implies that it's dangerous,
right?
And I would suggest that I don't know what the historical record looks like on cultures reassessing themselves as they move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, except we do know that Truth and Reconciliation.
Yes, absolutely.
That worked with, that has been done in some African nations, right? And is the U.S. brave enough to go into a Truth and Reconciliation process saying, wait a minute, about those Incas.
It's important to remember, too, that the Inca and Aztec civilizations were themselves empires that oppressed other surrounding cultures,
right?
And they were brought down not by a couple hundred heroic Spaniards, but in an alliance with those oppressed people. So it is eminently, it is just immensely complicated sorting out, the morality of all of this.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, and we have this whole thing about Native Americans as being these peaceful environmentalists, and but that's not people. People aren't like that, right?
It's dehumanizing to actually this myth of sort of heroic nobility, the noble red man. That's dehumanizing too.
Exactly. Oh, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, they were the Cherokee, the Trail of Tears. That was Cherokee chiefs actually selling out their own people, right, for money. So we'll sign this document, U.S. government, Andrew Jackson, for 30 pieces of silver, and our people have to move. Well, those people weren't under that chief, so yes, all of this is very, very complicated, and I mean, many of us can't say, oh, I'll just move back to blank, because there's no blank to move back to. That's not going to happen. So how can we have truth and reconciliation? And is religions a way to begin to open? Because theoretically, we're talking morality and ethics when we're talking religion. Are religions ways to begin to talk about this when your real estate agent is not going to talk about it, right? So, yeah, Ron.
The truth and reconciliation, I was so intrigued with that. And I remember playing with it in my mind until I went, well, how well that works will be worked out in the history of murder in that country, and whether or not the murder of any of those people who came forward and said, yes, I did this torture, will determine whether or not that society really does do reconciliation, or they only want the truth part.
Yeah.
It calls to mind for me. I mean, I'm absolutely on board with Black Lives Matter, but I remember also interacting with a South Asian Indian who worked for me. I may have told this story many times because I've been fascinated by it, who was in this country and for the summer and took a job with me. And in the fall, his British Empire scholarship was put into question because he was from Tanzania. And all the Asian Indians had been kicked out once they got their independence. And the Black population there said, you don't own that farm anymore. You have to leave that ranch. And so he could not fulfill his British Empire scholarship by leaving Great Britain after he got his college degree and going back to his home country because he couldn't go there. And it's a reminder that kind of divide and conquer stuff is everywhere.
Yep.
And every time I see it, I want to go, oh, who's winning and who's losing?
Right. No, absolutely.
Try to construct human benevolence and openness to hear and accept those kind of issues. I think these are very big problems.
Yeah.
That's psychological and sociological.
Yeah. Well, and my argument though is that, and maybe I'm, it could, maybe I'm wrong, but it is those of us who grapple with these issues.
Yeah.
And we're not going to say, Poland for Roman Catholicism, right? We're not going to make those kinds of those divisions. We're going to try to say that there is a humanity here that underlies, because the prediction is that in 20 years, within 20 years, 1.3 billion people will be environmental refugees.
Oh yeah.
And that 1.3 billion. So, we will or we won't figure out a way to share the planet because it's shrinking.
Yeah.
And,
Well, those are big issues.
one of my plans is to be long dead by the time all of this comes up, so I don't have to deal with it. But that's not a good plan. That's not hope. We've got to figure out how to talk about human rights on a level that doesn't say that these Indians have this and you don't get it, and this Roman Catholic does get this and this Protestant doesn't. Those kinds of big abstractions are not what's going to solve human problems.
We need something like maybe species rights.
There you go.
For continued survival.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, these are the questions that are going to go forward. And, Anthony is going to be leading the liberal religious ideas that are going to go into the late 21st century when most of us here have checked out. And these are going to be the things that we're going to have to grapple with.
It's a lot on your shoulders, Anthony.
And I did, so if he's carrying this message forward, I want him to realize that I don't necessarily think the greatest generation did all that well. I mean, they did leave us with atomic bombs, waste, and power, and they left us with governing with black budgets.
Yeah.
We can't know what the government's doing.
Right. No.
Those
Yes.
are huge problems.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I think that, one of the things about looking at religious history that reveals, like, for example, Madame Blavatsky and Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, they were all refugees from the Russian Empire as it collapsed, right? And so this is the way these ideas, spread around. So we need to be able to think about human ideas as valid without running over other human ideas, and that we're going to be living, it's not a melting pot, but some kind of crazy quilt out there in the future that does respect difference in a way that we haven't even imagined yet, and here in the US, I mean, we have a very worrisome situation, but actually, that's the way it's been for most of U.S. history, right? Yeah. It's just post-World War II that's been kind of nice, but we were stealing other people's stuff to make it kind of nice. So, we had.
I think that's the challenge, right? Is the fact that, at least from where I stand, we can't necessarily be nostalgic and say, well, let us just implode our contemporary societies and then rebuild from zero, right? Or go back to living underground or any other. But what we could potentially explore is, given where we are now, given, our intellectual, economics, cultural, and all these other productions, how do we reassess?
Yeah.
Hopefully in a more horizontal understanding, the appreciation of human worth, and how do we then see as equal all the other societies, cultures, and individuals, defining them according to how they want to be defined and understood, and not necessarily one dominant group saying, well, we want to be generous and this is what you get, or this is what we're willing to engage and allow. I think it is scary. And I think that it takes bravery to really recognize that we have done all these things, right? Because I think one aspect would be killing and doing all these other things due to survival, right? And you trying to live within your worldview. And the other is decimating complete societies because we just really want to expand because we need space.
Living space.
Lebensraum.
Lebensraum. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, the great call of the Nazis. Yeah, exactly. I think, that's the challenge. And, it's a liberal religious challenge. It's a liberal political challenge. because we aren't saying that 1950s American white male society was the be all end all. We don't think that. Some of us enjoyed it, you know, but it's not right, and we are not going to support political leaders who call us back to that. We want to go forward. And what does that multicultural world? How do we even construct it, and how do we understand each other? And the first thing we have to do is question our own assumptions, I think, and that and that's why I think decolonizing humanism is a good question, even if it never works out. Can we get at some way of addressing the morality and ethics of otherness, in which none of us are other. It's all we, and until we learn that, we're not going to be very helpful to anybody or the planet itself, So I'm glad that Anthony is going to write a paper on that. And but more than the paper, it's out there speaking to the congregations. It's out there communicating with people, teaching those of us who grew up with a very different paradigm. Not our fault, but we grew up with, some of us grew up with John Wayne and that. And how can we begin to reimagine the entire reality that we live in, basically? Because this one is killing us pretty quick, actually. So that's not a hopeful way to end, though. So let's hear a hopeful note before we sign off. But I do have hope. I really do have hope. And
overcome.
Facing, if you got cancer, you can ignore it. That works. For a while.
To a point.
Or you can go to the doctor, and the whole planet needs to go to the doctor. What's the doctor? And I believe this idea, it is the physician. So, well, thank you all for joining in today. It's always great hearing from folk. And next week, we're going to talk about some more about the actual Unitarian and Universalist traditions, people who weren't flaky, in other words. So thank you all.